Have you ever heard the saying, history repeats itself? I saw a cartoon once where the main character said, I don't need to listen to history. I don't need to learn history. It repeats itself. He used the saying as an excuse. Though disturbing, it's often valuable to look at the dark chapters in human history because, as the saying goes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. As we engage with some of those darker chapters, we see patterns, we see warning signs that can help us to not repeat the past. It's also common, though, when you look at some of the darker chapters, to see individuals who stood against the darkness and to be encouraged then by the light that they brought during those dark days. We're going to see that and more as we engage with one of the darker chapters in human history. We're going to look at Mark chapter 14 and 15 today, and you'll see the betrayal, the injustice, the rejection, the abuse, and the abandonment that was heaped on Jesus. Mark records it for us. And like in part 4 of this series, I'll read what Mark wrote, and then I'll point out what we see. So let's just jump right into it, shall we? Mark chapter 14, verse 43. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. With him was a mob with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. His betrayer had given them a signal. The one I kiss, he said. He's the one. Arrest him and take him away under guard. So when he came, immediately he went up to Jesus and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. And they took hold of him and arrested him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Jesus said to them, have you come out to me with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal to capture me? Every day I was among you teaching in the temple, and you didn't arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then they all deserted him and ran away. Now a certain young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth was following him, and they caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran away naked. Okay, there's some unexpected details here that you kind of wonder, like, Mark, what's up with that? And by the way, aren't you glad there are no pictures? Like, I mean, there's the whole thing with the ear being cut off. We're like, wow, and like that scene isn't going to make the children's storybook Bible, is it? At least I hope not. Just the blood gushing from the ear. Wow. And then the last one we just read, the man who ran away naked, the youth there, right? You didn't want to know this, but I'll share this with you. I did a little research and found out that ordinarily men in those days, they wore an undergarment called a chiton. And this young man only had a sindon, which is an outer garment, so that when it was seized, off he went. Now this sindon, the outer garment, was usually made of wool, but as you can imagine, that might have been scratches. This one was made of linen, which would have been much more expensive, which indicates this guy was a person of means, and that's all he was wearing anyway. So, and he ran away naked. Why, Mark? What? TMI, too much information. I think the point perhaps that Mark is making here is everyone forsook Jesus. Everyone, including the guy who he ran away naked. He was more afraid than embarrassed. Back to the main things that we want to talk about. Here is the first big instance in the story. You have the betrayal by Judas, right? Betrayal by Judas, by the treachery, like we talked about in part 4. Here's a fun fact for you. The verb that is used to describe Judas's kiss is actually a compound word that means to like kiss fervently. Usually it's translated that way. Here it probably indicates a prolonged kiss, not just a peck on the cheek, to make sure everybody knew who Jesus was. When we lived in Portugal, you would greet people with a kiss, and so, but it was just a quick peck. Is your cheek to their cheek, right, left, right, just that kind of, you're not, no lips to the cheek or anything like that. It was a greeting. Perhaps they had something like this, but for Judas, he went out of the way like, to make sure everybody saw, here's the guy, right? And so we got the betrayal by Judas, then you have the abandonment by the disciples. They all fled. Let's continue. Verse 53, they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes assembled. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the high priest's courtyard. He was sitting with the servants, warming himself by the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they couldn't find any. For many were giving false testimony against him, and the testimonies did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, stating, "We heard him say, 'I'll destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I'll build another one not made by the hands.'" Yet their testimony did not agree even on this. Then the high priest stood up before them all and questioned Jesus. "Don't you have any answer to what these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and did not answer. And again the high priest questioned him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," Jesus asked and said. "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. Then some began to spit on him, to blindfold him and to beat him, saying, "Prophesy." The temple servants also took him and slapped him. All four Gospels affirm that the trial of Jesus took place in 2 stages. There was a religious trial followed by a civil one. And if you take all the accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you put them together, you find that there are 3 episodes in each stage. Commentators, I'm indebted to them for helping point this out to me. So the religious trial included the 3 parts, right? The preliminary hearing before Annas, and then the trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. That's what we just read about. And then the trial before the same group just after daybreak. We'll get back into that perhaps in a moment. The 3 episodes of the civil trial were the trial before Pilate, and then there was a trial before Herod Antipas, and then the trial before Pilate, part 2, which then concluded. What you see when you look at this, friends, is a travesty of justice. This is injustice. It is fake justice. Let me point out a few things. Likely, not all 70 members of the Sanhedrin were present, right? That's how many there were. So Mark says they all gathered, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of them were there. I think one of the big indicators is that this group typically met in a major area in the marketplace. This time they're meeting in a home. So I doubt all 70 were there, but probably just enough for a quorum, possibly with many of the dissenters being uninvited, right? Second, did you notice the verdict was chosen before the case began? They had already decided that Jesus had to go and they were going to find a way to kill him. The verdict, this is not justice. There's a trial, but no justice. And third, the witnesses. There were lots of witnesses, but this trial is taking place when? At night, right? Which is kind of weird. How are these witnesses available during the night? Right? This is weird. This is fake justice. And then the case was not thrown out, even when cross-examination proved inconsistencies according to the law of the land of that day. If there were inconsistencies, if you couldn't get the witnesses to agree, you had to throw it out. But they didn't. Instead, the trial continued until they could find an appropriate charge. The religious authorities seemed to be incapable of fabricating an accusation based on the testimony of others, witnesses. So finally, the chief priest had to resort to, well, if we can't get witnesses, they're going to agree on something that's chargeable. Maybe we can get Jesus to testify about who he is, and then we'll use his own testimony about himself against him. And so they asked him point blank, "Are you the Messiah?" Right? And Jesus answered. This is fake justice. And then, of course, you see the rejection by the Jewish rulers in that day. If you wanted to show somebody that you despised them and you rejected them, you spit on them. That's what you did. Hit them too, that's great, but the spitting. I think even to some degree in our culture, to spit on somebody, it communicates something very, very powerful. It's a repudiation, it's a rejection. It's like, right? That's what they did. And then you also notice the abuse by the Jewish rulers. They played a little game. Here, Mark says it was called prophesy, right? Prophesy. If you read a couple of the other Gospels, we get a little bit more what's going on there. They would say, prophesy, who is it that hit you? They had blindfolded Jesus. And based on this super warped interpretation of Isaiah 11, verses 2 to 4, which seemed to indicate that the Messiah would have the ability to judge by smell without the need for sight. This is what they're doing. They're playing this game with him, like blindfold him, and then they hit him. And like, if you're really the Messiah, you'd be able to sniff. You know who it was that hit you. You don't need to see. Of course, Jesus, yeah, we have every reason to believe Jesus did know who hit him, but he remained silent. But they're using that against him, and they're just abusing him. Let me hit you. Let me hit you. Temple servants also were slapping Jesus. Mark chapter 15, the story continues. As soon as it was morning, having held a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, the chief priests tied Jesus up, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, are you king of the Jews? He answered, you say so. And the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate questioned him again, aren't you going to answer? Look how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still said nothing and did not answer. So Pilate was amazed by this, right? More fake justice. What was the charge? Well, the charge at the religious trial was blasphemy. Jesus is going to be condemned for envy. Really, that's what's really going on. The chief priests, the temple rulers, they are envious. But you can't kill somebody for envy. So they came up with an answer that the Jews would say, oh, wow, he deserves death. Blasphemy. But if you take somebody and accuse them of blasphemy to the Roman government is like, we don't care. Right? We don't care. As long as he's not being nasty to Caesar, we don't care. We don't care about your gods, and we don't care about blasphemy. So, time for a new charge. Treason, right? Treason. Well, what kind of treasonous charge are you going to come up with for Jesus? Well, evidently the chief priest told Pilate, oh, yeah, it's treason. Like, this guy claims to be the king. And we already know there's only one king. His name is Caesar, right? So that's got to be treason, right? Pilate, wink, wink, right? He's fake justice so that they could get Rome to execute him for blasphemy, which was really all about envy. Verse 6, at the festival, Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested. And there was one named Barabbas who was in prison with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them as was his custom. And Pilate answered them, do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you? For he knew it was because of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so they'd release Barabbas to them instead. And Pilate asked them again, then what do you want me to do with the one that you call the king of the Jews? And again they shouted, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What has he done wrong? But they shout all the more, crucify him! And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. More fake justice. Pilate knew. You saw it right there in verse 10. Pilate knew that the real motive was envy. He knew the motive but didn't throw the case out. He knew that this had nothing to do with treason. He didn't throw the case out. Instead, Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd more than serve justice. And then you see the rejection by the crowd. They picked a murderer instead of Jesus. I mean, I've had times in my life that were humiliating where, you're middle school, grade school, right? You're going to play kickball, football, or whatever, and they pick somebody else instead of you, and then they pick somebody else instead of you, and then they pick somebody else instead of you. But a murderer picked instead of you? That is a big time rejection. Let's continue. Verse 15. After having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away into the palace, that is the governor's residence, and called the whole company together. And they dressed him in a purple robe, twisted together a crown of thorns, and put it on him. And they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews, right? And they were hitting him on the head with a stick and spitting on him, getting down on their knees. They were paying him homage. And after they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and they put his clothes back on him. He received the abuse. Continues. This time it's abuse by the soldiers. Verse 21, then they led him out to crucify him. And they forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. Then they crucified him. And they divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide who would get it. And now it was 9 a.m, and they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge written against him was, "The King of the Jews." And they crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right, one on his left. And those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their head and saying, "Ha! The one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests and the scribes were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. You see, the abuse continues. This time it's by the crowd. They're yelling insults. They're throwing his words back in his face. You ever had that happen to you? So he takes your words, maybe twists them, but they throw them into your face. So harsh. That's what they're doing. And the mocking, and the lying too. Like, if you come down, we'll believe in you. All you got to do is, right? The mocking, the lying. Verse 33, when it was noon, the darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me?" 6 hours in. Pick another part up of the story. This time it's abandonment by God. Been abandoned by all of his disciples, now by his Father. Verse 35. When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "See, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and fixed it on a stick and offered him a drink and said, "Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." Instead, Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. Death. This was a dark hour in human history. Downright nasty. Did you see it? Humanity was downright nasty. It wasn't enough to kill him. They had to try to break him. Right? Downright nasty. I want to talk in our remaining minutes about some present day implications. That's what happened then. I want to talk about how that impacts us now, here, now, this chapter of human history. First, do Jesus' actions lend credence to the claim that he's the Son of God? I keep pointing this out, that Mark has done us this favor. He started his book with Jesus, the Son of God, and then he's given us all this evidence to help us to know Jesus, but also to come to that conclusion that Jesus really is the Son of God. Do Jesus' actions in this particular chapter lend credence to that claim that he is the Son of God? The Sanhedrin said no. No, absolutely not. If he was the Messiah, he would know who hit him, even if his face was covered. So no, right? They said there's no way he can be the Messiah, and that was their rationale. The crowd said no. They said if he was the Son of God, then he would come down from the cross and prove it. And so the crowd's like, look, here's the evidence. He's still there. It's been 6 hours. He hasn't come down. So no, absolutely not. He can't be the Son of God. I'm wondering, in our day, in our age, are we still doing the same thing? Are we setting up these expectations and like, if he was really God, then he would, whatever, right? He would have answered my prayer for my sick mom. If he was really God, then he would solve world hunger. Or if he was really God, he wouldn't let this world be one where there's so much suffering. If he was really God, then boom. And see, that's not happening. So there it is. There's your proof. Why do you need to keep looking? He obviously isn't God. Are we still doing the same thing that they were doing then? Friends, I want to be gentle. especially with those who are still making up their mind about, is Jesus the Son of God? I want to be gentle with you, but I also need to tell you the truth. And the truth, I believe, is this: it is often our expectations, not a lack of evidence, that keeps us from recognizing Jesus' true identity. And if you're wrestling with that, like, is Jesus really God? I would encourage you to step back and go, whoa. Am I struggling with my own expectations? Like, if he was really God, then I think he should and he would, or whatever. Or am I struggling with a lack of evidence? And I would encourage you to take a look at the evidence. I think you'll find that it's there. Well, move to a second implication for those of us who are alive and breathing today. It's the observation that sin has made us nasty and inhumane. No, we don't all go around spitting on Jesus. Praise God for that. But sin has made the old heart nasty and inhumane. And if you look at history, you realize we keep having episodes where that comes out. And that shows that there is no cure for the old heart, and there's no reforming the old heart. It's got to die and be offset with a new heart, which is what Jesus came to do. And as you think about what those guys were saying to Jesus day there on the cross, come down, we'll believe you, come down, prove it. If Jesus comes off that cross and the payment for that old heart's sin is not made, and if Jesus comes off that cross and therefore his blood is not shed, so there is no new covenant, and because there's no new covenant, there's no new heart. Friends, if Jesus comes off that cross, we are dead. We are dead in our sins, and we are forever going to live with our old heart, the one that makes us, when pushed enough, makes us nasty, downright nasty and inhumane. Implication number 3. You might wonder, why is it that there's only one way to heaven? And why won't God let someone in who rejects Jesus? That sounds narrow, perhaps harsh. I think that's a fair question. Let me give out a couple thoughts. I think God would say, I'd love to have you in heaven. I would love to have you in heaven. And in fact, let me go farther than that. There's no excuse for not meeting the entry requirements to get into heaven. The price was high, perfection, but that price has been paid. Jesus paid it. So there's no excuse for not meeting the entry requirements. As Andy Stanley once pointed out, right? The requirement's the same for everybody. Everybody can meet it because of Jesus, and everyone gets in the same way, right? There's no excuse for not meeting the entry requirements. But second, refusing to trust the one who paid it. Man, that is blatantly offensive. Blatantly offensive. Number 4, Jesus knows what suffering and sacrificial love are like, doesn't he? Are you, friend, suffering at the hands of people? If so, I'm sorry. That's not the way it's supposed to be. But if that's happening, I need you to know that Jesus knows what that's like. Are you suffering when you're doing the right thing? So again, I'm sorry, that is not the way it's supposed to be. Everything in us knows that justice means you suffer when you do the wrong thing, not when you do the right thing. So if you are suffering when you're doing the right thing, I am truly sorry about that. But know this as well, Jesus knows what that is like. He was doing the right thing and he ended up suffering big time. Are you, friend, loving someone sacrificially? A love that, like, you're loving them and it is costing something. Costing you perhaps dearly, sacrificially. And are you loving and your love isn't being reciprocated? Yeah, and that's not the way it's supposed to be, and I wish it wasn't that way. But please know that Jesus knows what that is like. Man, does he ever know what it's like to love people who do not love him back. And he knows what it's like to love someone all the way to the point of death. It cost you everything. Jesus knows what that's like. Are you feeling the cost of obeying God? There are times when obeying God brings blessings, and there are other times when obeying God brings a big bill that has to be paid. Are you feeling that cost right now of obeying God? If so, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But I want you to know that Jesus knows what that is like. Man, does he ever. I still find it hard to go into nursing homes. You're like, whoa, change your gears. Yeah, you're right, change your gears. I still find it really hard to go into nursing homes. When I was 7 years old, I was going into one with my mom and my dad and my two brothers. My brother Dan would have been about 5, and my brother David was a newborn. And as we came in to the nursing home, a lady nurse met us in the front desk or whatever, and there were several residents who were in kind of like a little foyer area right there as you came into, and I heard this receptionist or this nurse pull my mom aside and say, beware of that lady over there. If she gets a hold of your kids, she's going to kiss them to death. Now, you guys, you're way smarter than I am, and certainly smarter than I was at a 7-year-old. Here's what I heard. You hear she'll kiss him to death, and you know what that means. Like, oh, she'll just grab him and she'll like kiss, 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 you know. And or maybe she'll even do like the grandparent thing, grab the little cheeks, you know. Kind of, I don't think that's a thing anymore, is it? Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's what you hear. Here's what I heard. I heard kiss, death. She's in a medical facility. So here's what I was going through my head. My 7-year-old brain's like, this woman has got some serious contagious disease. I grew up in the church. I'd heard of things like leprosy, you know, unclean, unclean, right? So I'm picturing that, right? She touched you. If you not careful, this woman, she's going to kiss you and you're going to die, right? Leprosy or something else like that. That's what goes on in my brain. So I am like, I got my eyes on this woman. I'm like, keep away from this woman. We find the person we came to visit. We're like, phew, you know, everything's going okay. On the way out, I'm just following my parents. They're in front of me. I'm following my parents. This woman grabbed me. I didn't see her coming. I didn't know, you know, or maybe she was, you know, stealthy, or maybe she was fast. You know, maybe people that age can move quickly. I don't know. All I know is she caught me, she kissed me. We're out in the parking lot now, me and my parents, and I am sobbing uncontrollably. And my parents cannot seem to calm me down. And finally they get me calmed down enough. My mom's like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, she kissed me. And my parents were like, what? And eventually we get the whole thing out. The woman, the one with the kiss of death, she's kissed me and now I'm going to die. Do I even get in the car? You know, because I probably, you know, make my brother sick and die too. And they calmly explained to me, no, that's not what that means when they said she'll kiss you to death. It doesn't mean you're going to die. It just means she's going to kiss you over and over and over again. And I knew I was a 7-year-old me, but it's still hard to go into nursing homes to this day. Jesus kissed us. Not literally, like we weren't standing there at the cross and, you know, but in doing what Jesus was doing for us there, suffering the betrayal and the abandonment and the abuse and the injustice and the fake justice, right? And the rejection and all that. And then staying on the cross, refusing to come off until it was finished, until the payment had been paid. In doing all that and doing it for us, Jesus kissed us. Only we were the lepers, so to speak. Jesus, when he kissed us, he caught our death. It killed him. He was murdered for our transgressions, right? He caught our death, what we had, rebellion against God, that we had a bad case of it. It was fatal, and he caught it. And as he kissed us, he not only caught it, he passed his health and his life to us. Only completely unlike the story I told a minute ago. It wasn't done in ignorance, and it wasn't done in stealth. It was done in love. Because Jesus kissed us, caught our death, and passed his health and life to us. Because even in our state of rebellion against God, Jesus loved us.